Our next speaker is ARC Future Fellow. Professor Richard Holden is one of Australia's leading economic researchers with a skill for unravelling complex economic issues. Based in the Australian School of Business, he is to co-lead the Grand Challenge on Inequality together with Professor Rosalind Dixon. His speech, How to Redistribute Network Capital, Mitigating Inequality Without Killing Productivity. Here is Richard Holden. Thank you.
I want to tell you a story about a famous New York real estate developer. His father was a famous New York real estate developer. His sons are heavily involved in the organisation. He had a penchant for French antiques. He knew all the key financiers around New York and around the rest of the United States. At one point, he got heavily over-leveraged by personally guaranteeing corporate debt and nearly went bankrupt. And in his heyday, he would hold court 2 or 3 nights a week at the most exclusive nightclub in Manhattan. His name was William Zeckendorf, and he was the key leading real estate developer in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. About 2 years ago, when I started talking about him, I used to refer to him as the Donald Trump of his era. And over that 2 years, that seemed to become increasingly unfair, so now I just refer to him as William Zeckendorf. Now, Zeckendorf was responsible for developing a whole lot of really important properties and sites. Indeed, he procured the land on which the United Nations now resides. But there's one development in particular which really captures why he was so successful and why he made so much money out of it. And that's a development in Montreal, Canada, called Place Ville Marie. Now, Place Ville Marie was, as it started out, was basically a train junkyard in Montreal. And the Canadian National Railroad had been trying since the 1920s to develop this site into something that was going to be a vibrant commercial area with lots going on. They asked sort of everyone they knew in Canadian real estate development, and nobody thought it was a very good idea and nobody could get it done. So they went to Zeckendorf and said, in 1955, what can you do about it? And he took on the challenge. And the challenge was that over in St. James Street was the real commercial hub of Montreal. And that's where all the key corporates were, the financiers, the professional services firms. And as Zeckendorf said, nobody initially thought we were going to put a project up as big as we said we were going to. And nobody wanted to move across town on spec to some site or commit to doing so unless a whole lot of other people were going to do the same thing. And that was the challenge Zeckendorf faced, getting people to believe that everybody else was going to go along with this. And connected though he was, he really struck out initially and had a very, very hard time getting this project off the ground. Till finally, through a connection of his from a board that he sat on, he got Royal Bank of Canada to agree to be the anchor tenant for the centrepiece of this development. And as soon as he got them, he managed to get MetLife to give fully half the money to finance the entire project. Armed with that, he went to another large potential tenant, Aluminium Limited, and they said, this thing's going to happen, we're in. And from there, the whole thing just snowballed to success. The way Zeckendorf put it in one of his memoirs was, the greater the number of groups we could interconnect, the greater the value we could add and profit we could make. And that's how he thought of himself, as bringing groups together and connecting them and making people believe things were going to happen, in his case, real estate developments. And I could tell you similar stories about Barangaroo in Sydney or Docklands in Melbourne, but it's not really just a phenomenon about real estate development. Once you start thinking about it, you might conclude that most projects in most walks of life require bringing together people with disparate abilities, talents, and sometimes amounts of money. And that's hard to do, but some people seem to have a particular knack for being able to do it, people like Zeckendorf. So you might say, what attributes do people like Zeckendorf have that make them particularly well suited to being able to do this kind of thing? And that's the question that my co-author and longtime friend Robert Akerlof, who's at the University of Warwick, asked in a series of papers that started a couple of years ago. The first of which was just published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and it's called Movers and Shakers. And what we concluded in that paper and showed formally was that people who can coordinate economic activity by occupying a central role in a social or economic network are able to both create value and earn large returns for doing that. So what do? Well, in the language of economics, they coordinate higher order beliefs. So let's make that real with a slightly simpler picture of that. So here's World War I trench, and you can imagine that the field marshal a few miles down the road in the chateau, after a couple of cognacs, has said time to attack, and sent the order down to the captain who says we're going over the top. And the soldiers are patriotic and they want to go, but they're not idiots. They know that if they're the only one that goes over the top, then they're dead for sure. So they want to go as long as everybody else is going to go. And so they think to themselves, well, is my mate going to go? And he thinks, well, is my mate going to go? And the original guy says, well, I wonder if my mate thinks that I'm going to go. And he says, well, I wonder if he thinks that I think that he thinks that I think that I'm going to go. And that's what higher order beliefs are. They're beliefs about beliefs, and they play a really central role in game theory. So anyone who's seen A Beautiful Mind and heard about John Nash and his equilibrium concept, well, his equilibrium concept and everything that's gone with that in modern game theory is really about higher order beliefs playing a very central role. And what we showed is that people who occupy a central place in a social or economic network are able to coordinate higher order beliefs. And that's a valuable thing to do. That helps bring people together. That coordinates economic activity. But what we also showed is it's not always the most talented people who are able to do that. You could think about talent on dimensions of how good a communicator they are, how good their quality of information is, how many existing connections they have when they come into thinking about doing this sort of thing. And what we showed is that if you're below some threshold level of ability on any of those dimensions, then you're never going to turn out to be the mover and shaker, the Zeckendorf type. But if you're above that level, then it could be any one of those people. It could be any one of us. So it's valuable, it's good, it coordinates economic activity, but there's an element of return for luck or pay for luck. So it's valuable, but there's an element of luck. Now, once you start thinking about people who earn a lot of money, you think about all that we hear about these amazing returns that certain people in society earn, and we start thinking about income inequality. And so what I'll show you now is a chart courtesy of the economists Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty, which shows you, here it is, which shows you the income distribution in the United States of America. And you'll see that the bottom 90% of people, on average, this is households, earn about $30,000 a year. And then you'll see that as we go up and we get to, say, the top 1%, people are earning a little less than $300,000 a year. It's a lot of money. Then you see people, in the top 1% earning as much as $1.3 million a year. And when we get to the top 1/10 of 1% of households in the United States, they earn on average $6 million a year. That's quite unequal. In fact, that can be made precise and measured, and that is the fourth most unequal income distribution in the OECD. Now, I could show you a similar chart for Australia, and it wouldn't look quite as bad or quite as scary, but it is bad, and it's been getting worse. And Australia is now the 10th most unequal country measured this way in the OECD. And that's a league table which I would suggest we don't really want to be high up on. Now, economists, and I can say this as an economist, we've kind of struggled to be able to explain why people can earn these very, very vast sums. We've really only to date had two explanations for that. And one is that they have some human capital. They have some skills, some characteristics, and those things earn a return in the market. And for sure, that's part of the story. And we've said people have physical capital, financial capital, and that earns a return in the market. And for sure, that's part of the story. But if I tell you that the 10th highest paid hedge fund manager in Greenwich, Connecticut earns $1 billion a year, you might say to yourself, well, yeah, they've probably got some skills. And, you earn $1 billion a year for long enough, they're going to have some financial capital. But can those two factors really explain all of this? And what we think is that people's ability to bring disparate pots of money and sources of talent together, their network capital, is part of the explanation for why people earn these vast amounts of money. That network capital is a real part of the story. So if you think that that is part of the story and you say, well, I worry about that chart, I worry about this chart, and I certainly do, then the natural question to ask, of course, is what can we do about it? And that's a little bit tricky because we want to redistribute this network capital, but we don't want to destroy it. It's performing a valuable role. It's creating jobs. It's creating growth. It's leading to higher wages in many circumstances. There's value to it. But there's also an element of luck involved in it. And then there's this dramatic rise in inequality that it leads to. And so the real question is, how do we redistribute this network capital without destroying it? Now, the first thing that might occur to you is, well, I just heard about this thing about if you're below a certain threshold, then you're not even in the race. And so accident of birth, it would seem, could lead you to not even have a chance to become an owner and user and possessor of network capital. So one thing we could do is say we want to raise, on all those relevant dimensions, we want to raise people up to that minimum threshold. A kind of capability style approach like economist Amartya Sen and political philosopher Martha Nussbaum advocated in a somewhat different context in the 1980s. Here we'd be emphasising some of those same capabilities that they did, but also some other capabilities. So that's one thing you could do. But that really just puts everyone in the lottery to become part of the inequality problem. The real question then still is, how do you redistribute it? So the natural thing for someone to think is to say we should tax it. We should put a Bernie Sanders level tax on this stuff, and that will redistribute it. And it will. But I fear that it will destroy it as well. So the first thing is this stuff is valuable. So once you put that kind of tax on it, you're going to destroy a lot of that value. The other thing is a tax like that isn't very narrowly tailored. It doesn't target network capital. It's going to target returns that come from all kinds of capital, from, in particular, human capital. So the Zuckerbergs and Cannon Brookses and Farquhars of the world who come up with great innovations and get returns for that are going to be penalised as well, and you're going to discourage those kinds of innovations as well. So that doesn't seem so appealing as a candidate. And then you might zero in on these connections. It's got something to do with who's connected to whom, so maybe we should focus in on the connections. Well, the most obvious point to raise is that if you're not connectable, then you can't get connected. You think about that for a moment, and it brings to the front of one's mind that segregation in all of its forms, residential, socioeconomic, racial, could prevent people from being able to be part of these very valuable networks. Not only being able to be at the centre of them, but also be connected to people who are near the centre of them. If you like, second-order network capital by being connected to the most connected, or third-order network capital by being connected to someone who's connected, and so on. And it would start to focus on very important access programs, like, for instance, the one that's been going on at UNSW for nearly 40 years and emphasising the importance of things like that. You might go further still and say, I want to really understand where and when these connections are formed and do something right at that point in time. So there are many universities around the world who now offer quite generous scholarships for undergraduate education from those from less socioeconomic advantaged backgrounds. If you get into Harvard or Yale College and certain other places these days, your parents earn less than $250,000 a year, you get in for free. You pay no tuition. Okay? And that's a great and important thing to do. But there are very few scholarships for, say, MBA programs. And if you think, as people, students in MBA programs in which I've taught often say, key thing in business school is not listening to you, Professor Holden. It's forming these connections with all of these people. They're wanting to say, we're trying to form network capital here, okay? And so if you think that's where a lot of these connections get formed, then maybe we should be much more aggressive in targeting MBA scholarships and access to MBA programs to people from less advantaged backgrounds as well. Maybe it starts in secondary school, so maybe we should be thinking a lot more about creating diverse public school districts rather than letting accidents of geography alone determine where people go to school, which connections they make, and their lifetime access to network capital as a result of that. It's pretty clear that we don't have all the answers, but I think we know some of the questions. One of those questions, however, is not, should we do something about inequality? The question is what?